This king made a decision so shocking, so disturbing, that even history whispers about it to this day. He married his own sister. Not for love, not for desire, but for power. And the consequences would haunt Europe for generations. Imagine being born into a world where blood meant more than life itself, where the purity of a family's veins decided your fate, your body, your very existence. For one family, this belief was more than tradition. It was an obsession. An obsession so extreme it would leave children sick, deformed, and powerless. One of them, Charles II of Spain, would bear the weight of generations of secrecy and obsession. The halls of the royal palace were silent, except for whispers. Shadows flickered across gilded walls. Behind closed doors, the king and his sister, his queen, made choices that no ordinary mind could imagine. Choices that would echo for decades, reshaping the fate of nations. And yet, to the world outside, it seemed normal. To the nobility was tradition. To the people, they only saw a king and queen, a royal family keeping the crown intact. They didn't see the pain, the suffering, the children born to fulfill the obsession of bloodline purity. Today, we step inside those halls, into the darkest corridors of European royalty. We will uncover the truth behind one of history's most tragic decisions, see its devastating consequences, and understand how obsession with power destroyed not only a family, but an entire dynasty. Stay with me, because the story you are about to hear is as haunting as it is unbelievable. And by the end, you will see that history is sometimes darker than fiction. To understand this dark chapter of history, we need to step back into 16th, 17th century Europe, where royal families lived under rules few could imagine today. The Habsburgs, one of the most powerful dynasties of the era, believed in absolute bloodline purity. Every marriage, every union, every child had a purpose beyond love or happiness. It was about preserving power, wealth, and influence. Royalty did not see humans. They saw vessels carrying their legacy, their genes, their divine right to rule. Brothers married sisters, cousins married cousins, and the closer the blood, the more pure it was considered. Every decision was dictated by fear. Fear of losing the throne, fear of weakening the dynasty, fear of being erased from history. In their world, survival meant obedience to these rules, no matter how cruel or unnatural. The ordinary people of Europe knew little of these obsessions. They saw kings and queens adorned in gold, wielding authority and commanding armies. They did not see the suffering behind the velvet curtains, the sickly children, or the families trapped in cycles of obsession. Power came at a cost, and in this family, that cost was unimaginable. In this story, Charles II of Spain is the tragic symbol of what happens when human life is sacrificed for ambition. His story is not just a tale of one king. It is the story of an entire dynasty, collapsing under the weight of its own obsession. Every marriage, every birth, every whispered secret in dimly lit halls set the stage for disaster. As we move forward, keep this in mind. What seems like tradition to some, to others is a chain that binds, wounds, and destroys. And in the halls of European royalty, those chains were forged from blood, fear, and obsession. The Habsburg family was unlike any other in Europe. Their halls were lined with portraits of ancestors who had ruled for centuries, their faces frozen in oil, eyes staring down as if judging every decision made within the palace walls. But behind these grand images lay a secret darker than any portrait could reveal: obsession with blood. The king at the center of this story was a man whose life was dictated by fear, ambition, and the crushing weight of family expectation. His sister, a young woman barely older than a child herself, was not only his sibling, but also, by decree and necessity, his bride. Their marriage was a contract of power, a pact to maintain the so-called purity of the Habsburg bloodline. Love had no place here. Desire had no place here. Only duty, obligation, and tradition mattered. Generations of ancestors had set the stage for this moment. Cousins married cousins, brothers married sisters, all in the name of preserving a lineage thought untouchable. The family believed that even the smallest dilution of blood could weaken the throne, destabilize kingdoms, and undo centuries of power. And so, they continued this ritual of control, ignoring the human cost. Within the palace, the king and his sister moved like actors in a tragedy they could not escape. Portraits captured their smiles for the public, but behind closed doors, every step, every glance, and every child born was shadowed by fear. Every child was a gamble, a chance that the next generation would carry the curse of their ancestors. The Habsburgs' obsession was not just a personal choice. It was systemic, ruthless, and inevitable. It shaped the lives of everyone in the family and set the stage for devastation. And soon, the consequences would become impossible to ignore. The price of obsession was paid in flesh and bone. Children born into this twisted dynasty carried the weight of generations, both in name and in suffering. They were fragile from the very beginning, weak, sickly, and often deformed. Every birth was a gamble, every life a silent tragedy waiting to unfold. The most infamous of these children was Charles II of Spain, a boy whose life would be defined by the consequences of his family's obsession. He was born with a twisted jaw, a frail body, and countless ailments that would plague him his entire life. His appearance alone was a stark reminder of the dangers of marrying too closely, of valuing bloodlines over humanity. Charles could barely speak. His movements were awkward, his health delicate. And the cruelest blow, he could never produce an heir. The very purpose for which his family had endured generations of twisted unions, the continuation of a pure bloodline, was shattered in him. A dynasty obsessed with power, terrified of dilution, had created its own undoing. But Charles II was not an isolated tragedy. Across the Habsburg family, other children bore similar burdens, silent victims of ambition and obsession. Some died in infancy, others lived lives constrained by weakness, illness, and isolation. The family's pursuit of perfection in blood had produced only suffering and ruin. And the consequences were not merely personal. Each child's frailty threatened political alliances, destabilized the monarchy, and left Europe vulnerable to conflict. The obsession with maintaining purity, the belief that power was worth any cost, created a domino effect of tragedy that extended far beyond the palace walls. The story of Charles II and his family is a chilling lesson. When ambition overrides humanity, the results can be catastrophic, leaving scars that echo through history for generations. The consequences of the Habsburg family's obsession extended far beyond the palace walls. Europe watched as a dynasty crippled by its own decisions slowly unraveled, leaving political chaos in its wake. Alliances were strained, enemies emboldened, and the delicate balance of power shattered, all because one family had valued blood purity above reason. Charles II of Spain became the symbol of a monarchy in decline. His inability to produce an heir left the throne vulnerable, and European powers began maneuvering for influence. Wars loomed on the horizon, treaties were broken, and rival families smelled opportunity. What had begun as a personal obsession had escalated into a continental crisis. The Habsburgs' carefully constructed image of invincibility was crumbling. Other nations saw weakness where there had once been fear. Diplomats whispered in shadowed chambers, kings reconsidered marriages, and generals recalculated strategies. Every decision in the palace, every marriage, every birth, had ripple effects that stretched across borders. But the tragedy was not only political. It was deeply human. Behind every alliance and treaty, there were lives shaped by fear and expectation. Families were pressured into unions they did not want. Children bore the physical and emotional burdens of generations' obsessions. The dynasty's pursuit of perfection had created a cycle of suffering that touched every corner of their realm. By the time Charles II took the throne, the damage was done. The Habsburg dynasty had planted the seeds of its own downfall, and the consequences would be felt for decades. Europe's history would be forever altered, not by war alone, but by a family's relentless, tragic obsession with blood. Pause for a moment and imagine the weight of it all. A family obsessed with power, ruling over a kingdom with iron and fear, yet powerless to control the very consequences of their own decisions. Children born weak, sickly, and trapped in lives they did not choose. Parents bound by duty, unable to offer love or freedom. This was the cost of ambition taken to the extreme. Charles II's life embodies this tragedy. Every moment of suffering, every struggle to speak or move, every longing for a life that could have been normal, reflected centuries of obsession. He was the ultimate victim, not just of his parents, but of generations of rulers who believed blood was more important than humanity. And yet, in the darkness of these corridors, behind the golden doors and towering walls, there was a haunting kind of beauty in the story. The story of lives intertwined with history, of human fragility colliding with ambition. Every sickly child, every whispered secret, every tragic choice reminds us that power, unchecked and blind, comes at a human cost. We often think of history as distant events, wars, treaties, kings and queens, but the human cost is often invisible. Families crushed by expectations, lives lost to obsession, futures stolen before they even began. In the Habsburg dynasty, history and humanity collided, leaving echoes of suffering that resonate even today. This reflection is not just about the past. It is a reminder of the fragility of life, the danger of obsession, and the lasting consequences when ambition overtakes compassion. History may be filled with grand events, but the true tragedy is always human. And in Charles II's story, it is heartbreakingly clear. And so, the story comes full circle. One family's obsession with blood, power, and control reshaped the course of European history. Charles II of Spain, fragile and ill, became a living testament to centuries of ambition run unchecked. His life was short, his body weak, and his ability to rule diminished. But the consequences of his family's choices were monumental, echoing far beyond the walls of the palace. This is not just a story of a sickly king or a doomed dynasty. It is a story of obsession and human cost. Every decision made in pursuit of perfection left scars on children, on families, on kingdoms. Every whispered command, every forced marriage, every attempt to preserve purity instead of life created ripples that shaped Europe for decades. The throne may have been protected, but at what price? As we look back, we see how fragile power really is, how easily ambition can blind even the greatest dynasties. Charles II's suffering reminds us that history is not only about triumphs and battles, but also about the hidden tragedies. The human lives trapped behind golden doors, the consequences no one can escape. The Habsburg dynasty, once untouchable, was brought low not by war alone, but by its own obsession. One family's pursuit of perfection destroyed the very legacy they sought to protect. And in the quiet shadows of history, we are left with a haunting truth: that power without humanity is always a tragedy. So when you think of kings, crowns, and dynasties, remember this story. Remember the children who suffered, the lives that were controlled, the futures stolen. One family's obsession with bloodline purity didn't just shape history. It rewrote it in pain, in tragedy, and in echoes that will be remembered forever. History is darker than fiction, and in Charles II's life, that darkness is undeniable.